As I was leafing through the law reports, this case caught my eye. It concerns a dispute litigated in the 1850s, and I couldn't help noticing the first sentence below the large paragraph. The advocators, that's people bringing an appeal, claimed a right of way through the Park of Cally belonging to the respondent, Mr. Murray of Broughton. And on 1st June 1854, they knocked down certain gates and a wall which he had erected to obstruct them. Now, I'd never heard of this, even though I'd grown up in Gatehouse and been interested in local history. So my interest was sparked, and I've spent quite a lot of time off and on since finding out a little bit more about it, and that's what I'm going to tell you about tonight. I think we need to orient ourselves in space and time, and if we're going to do that, we need a map. And for my purposes, the best starting point, I think, is Ainsley's map of the Stewartry of Kirkcudbright, dated 1797. You can see the borough of Gatehouse at the top of this section of it, which had grown in the previous 4 decades from a single house near the bridge over the Fleet into, by this point, a small industrial town, which had become a borough of barony in 1795 with its own provost and bailies and town council. And you can see the old parish centres of Anworth, the kirk on the left, and Girthon, which we'll be paying more attention to down at the bottom of the map. The parish boundary was the River Fleet. You can see the old military road coming through from the right, a dotted line, and then entering Gatehouse at the top of what's now Ann Street. For those of you who know Gatehouse, the street perpendicular to the High Street at the clock tower came in at the top of Ann Street. And the old parish road is the road from the Kirk of Girthon, running pretty much straight up to join the old military road just outside, well, it looks as if it's just outside Gatehouse. And importantly, you can see Cally House just to the left of the old military road, and the old parish road. And it's this old parish road that's going to be the focus of attention. So that's, I hope, orients us in space. Just to give you some visual images, here's the old church at Girthon. It's on an eminence above the road down to Sand Green. Until the new parish church was built in Gatehouse in 1818, this remained the parish church, and so residents of the town walked, one assumes, along the old parish road down to Girthon to attend services. But even after the new church was built in 1818, this remained the graveyard for the parish until at least the 1850s, and continued to be used after that. And here's, again, to give you the visual picture, at Girthon there's a little clachan, and clachan of Girthon next to the church is shown on the screen. You can see the smithy at the corner here. That's the smithy in the photograph, and the old parish road is heading up towards, on the map, towards a wood, and ultimately heads off north towards Gatehouse. And here's Cally House. The central part was built in 1763 by James Murray of Broughton and Cally, the same year that he first let houses on what later became the High Street of Gatehouse. And you can see on the map the line of the old parish road running between Cally House and the Cally Gardens, which still exist, through what had become, in effect, the policies and parkland that James Murray developed after he'd constructed the house. One of the benefits of litigation about rights of way is people have to look very intensively at history and geography. And rather helpfully, when the right-of-way case was litigated in the 1850s, a map was produced which showed the rather complex history of the road layout around Cally. And I need to tell you a little bit about that to set the scene. This is the Old Parish Road, marked in pink or red, running from Girthon at the bottom up to Gatehouse at the top. And I've shown where Cally House is. There'd actually been a previous litigation involving a right-of-way in the 1760s, around the time when James Murray was developing his policies. It was a litigation actually about a right-of-way to fords across the River Fleet. And in the context of that litigation, James Murray had accepted that the Old Parish Road was a right-of-way. So that was a starting point. That was a recognised right-of-way in the 1760s. But in 1797, the year of Ainsley's map, an Act of Parliament authorised the construction of a new toll road between Dumfries and Newton Stewart through Gatehouse. And in 1804 to 5, the road trustees constructed a new turnpike road. And what I've done on this version of the map is I've shown the Old Parish Road, and we've got the new turnpike road in green, constructed in 1804 to 1805. And at that time, the factor of Cally Estate, Alexander Craig, who went to the road trustees and asked them to authorise the laying out of a new road to join Girthon to the new turnpike road, with a view to having the Old Parish Road in effect stopped up so that people would no longer take a right-of-way through the parklands of Cally. The road trustees set up a committee in order to identify a line of the road. It was chaired by Mr. Craig, the factor of Cally. It identified the line marked in blue, and the road trustees decided that upon that line being made and opened, they appoint the present road that passes betwixt the Mansion House and the gardens at Cally to be shut up and suppressed as being rendered unnecessary by the new line. That's the 1806 road. It's the road down to Sand Green. That's the view from Girthon up towards Enrick Farm, for those of you who know that area, and Gatehouse is just over the hill beyond. This minute became a critical feature of the court case in due course. From 1818 to 1823, the then proprietor of Cally, Alexander Murray, engaged in a major campaign of further works in order to expand, enhance, and enlarge and beautify the designed landscape around his house at Cally. The first thing he did was he constructed a new main road at his own expense, further away from Cally than the Turnpike Road, and that's the road marked in yellow. That's the line of the current main road. First part built in 1818, and then in 1823 they cut through what's called the Gala Hill, and that's the part of the road that runs down into Gatehouse, still called the Cut today. Murray spent £3,000 on that. He also built a nice new toll house in Gatehouse, which the road trustees described as a most substantial toll house, decidedly the best in the Stewartry. And he extended the 1806 road that had been built, marked in blue, so that it would join up with the new Turnpike Road. The road trustees accepted the new road in lieu of the old Turnpike Road, and they suppressed the old Turnpike Road, the one that was marked in green in the previous map. Those changes in the road network allowed Murray to extend the Cali policies right up to the line of the new road. And if you drive along that road down towards Gatehouse, you will see large stone walls on the left, and those were built by Murray as part of the campaign of enlarging, expanding, and beautifying the landscape around Cali. So what happened to the old parish road? Well, around 1818, Murray erected a gate across the road down at the Girthon end. And in 1823, he constructed a porter's lodge and gates, where it entered Gatehouse at the top end of Ann Street. That's the current view, top end of Ann Street. You can see the empty space where the gates were, and you can also see to the left of that, a postern gate which foot passengers could be allowed through, and the later court case discloses that the gatekeeper in the lodge had a chain that he could open the postern gate with to let people through. So he erected an 8-foot high gate across the road at this end, and the result of all this activity you can see in the first Ordnance Survey map we have, surveyed towards the end of the 1840s, and you can see the Park of Cali marked in green as it stood at that time. Now, although the road from Gatehouse, the old parish road, was now gated at each end, Murray still allowed people from Gatehouse to use it to go back and forth to Girthon to attend funerals. And people also went through for other reasons, to attend an Episcopalian chapel that was in the Cali grounds, or a charity school for girls that was also in the Cali grounds, or to draw water from a well, which is shown on the first 6-inch Ordnance Survey map, surveyed right at the end of the 1840s. This shows the old parish road in pink, coming in at the top of Ann Street, and I've circled the lodge that was shown in the photograph, and then just below that lodge you can see the well, which people used to come, according to the reports, everyone in Gatehouse used that well to draw water. But it appears that at this stage, the porter at the lock-up gate, as it was called the lock-up gate because the lodge was also used as the town lock-up, was generally ready to open it on request. And although at the Girthon end, the gate was originally locked, Murray discovered that from time to time it was forced open, and eventually he just left it so that people could use it as they wished. So that's the sort of geographical background. The other point I should make before I get to the central story I want to tell you about is that in the years running up to 1850, the question of public rights of various sorts had become a live issue across Scotland. Landowners in different parts of Scotland were doing similar things to Mr. Murray in terms of developing their private estates, and were increasingly, that was coming into tension, at least, with public rights. So in 1844, attempts by a landowner to prevent access to a well-known beauty spot in the Pentland Hills prompted the establishment of an association for the protection of public rights of ways, which still exists under another name. And in the following years, steps taken by the Duke of Atholl to bar public access across through Glen Tilt acquired, I think in the media parlance, they really cut through. There was a deliberate provocation of the Duke by the Professor of Botany of Edinburgh University, which, and the Duke's actions in terms of preventing access to the students and the professor got a lot of publicity, and over the following years and up into the 1850s, the national papers from time to time reported on the famous case at Glen Tilt. The Duke was lampooned in the pages of Punch and so on. Anyway, returning to Gatehouse, in 1845, Alexander Murray, the then owner of Cally, died, and the estate passed to Horatio Granville Stuart Murray, a relative of his, then 10 years old. And the estate was managed initially by trustees, and then until Horatio reached the age of majority, by Murray himself along with his curators, his mother, Mrs. Stuart, his grandfather, the Honourable Montgomery Stuart, and the Reverend Edward Stuart. 5 years later, in 1850, James McCulloch was appointed gatekeeper at the lock-up gate, here, and Mrs. Stuart instructed him to exclude anyone who did not have business on the Cally estate. A new gate was installed, surmounted with spikes and secured with a padlock. And the well just inside the gate was covered up and the water conducted by pipes to a lead cistern opposite Nielsen Square at the top of Gatehouse, so that people could still access water but wouldn't need to go through the gate to do so. 4 years later, in May 1854, the Girthon end of the road was closed with a wall, the same height as the adjoining Parkland Road. That's the point where the old parish road enters the Cally policies at the Girthon end. The lodge and the gateposts postdate the litigation, but I think you can see the height of the wall. And one has to envisage, I think, that the Stuarts instructed that the wall basically be extended across the road. This was too much for the people of Gatehouse. According to press reports, the provost and bailies, the magistrates of the town, and I'm quoting, gave orders for the town crier to summon the inhabitants on the 1st of June, the anniversary of the Battle of Drumclog, which was a famous Covenanting victory, to shut their shops and meet before the town hall at 6 o'clock in the evening. The call was responded to by the mass of the population. The meeting unanimously resolved to demolish the obstructions across the road, whereupon Provost Thomas Kirkpatrick, draper, Baillie Coulthart, a grocer, and ex-Provost Andrew Kirk, a brewer, led a procession of, the press report said, upwards of 800 people. The sheriff in the later litigation held that it was between 600 and 700, still a substantial number. Quoting from the press reports, young and old, from the octogenarian tottering on his staff to the infant in his mother's arms. And they walked up to the lock-up gate, a slightly rowdier scene than one sees in that photograph. The gate was locked, and again I'm quoting from the press reports, because one of the remarkable things about this whole incident is the extent to which it was covered by the press. The gate was locked, strong arms wielding sledge and crowbar made bolt and bar to fly, and on they went down the avenue till they came to the wall at the other end. The word was given, and soon not a vestige of it remained. The procession again formed, walked to the old kirkyard, and then quietly returned home. I think for the people of Gatehouse, this must have been personal, and for at least two of the instigators, it certainly was, because Thomas Kirkpatrick, ex-Provost Thomas Kirkpatrick, had his family tombstone at Girthon, and Baillie Coulthart, likewise, had his family tomb in the kirkyard. So the walls have been demolished, the gate has been taken off its hinges. Within a week, reports arrive in Gatehouse that the wall was being rebuilt. 5 householders, taking with them 2 hired men, set out to find out what was going on and, if necessary, to clear the way again. They discovered that the proprietors of Cally had already ordered the masons to undo their work, and the magistrates ordered a board to be put up at the lock-up gate, the top of Ann Street, stating that road was a right of way. The proprietors seem to have regarded that as a provocative act by the town council and ordered the board to be taken down and the wall to be rebuilt across the road at Girthon. So on the 22nd of June 1854, a second expedition was formed and armed with axes, saws, picks and crowbars, according to the press. At the lock-up gate, the porter was asked 3 times for admission, And when he replied he'd been instructed not to open the gate, they wrenched it from its hinges, marched to Girthon, where they again, demolished the rebuilt wall. What these events amounted to was contested. Was this, as Stuart Murray and his lawyers said, a mob which had taken the law into its own hands, destroying private property and trespassing across private land? Or were the proprietors, as the townspeople claimed, the first aggressors by stopping up a long-established right of way? The proprietors' Kirkcudbright solicitors wrote to ex-Provost Kirk and one of the other ringleaders, a man called Alexander Slimman, sending them the minute from the road trustees from 1806 and claiming that this had legally shut up the old parish road. And they were advised very politely that if they issued a public apology and paid the whole cost of replacing the gate, no further action would be taken against them. They declined the offer. So the proprietors reported the matter to the Procurator Fiscal, who commenced criminal proceedings against them in Kirkcudbright Sheriff Court. The Procurator Fiscal reported the evidence to Crown Counsel in Edinburgh, who instructed that the proceedings should be discontinued on the basis that the matter should be let alone as being one of those rights belonging to the community that should not be interfered with by the Crown. And according to the Dumfries and Galloway Courier, this perceived victory placed ex-Provost Kirk and Mr. Slimman in a distinguished and elevated position, and so far as the locality is concerned, upon the very pinnacle of patriotism. And a few days later, the Dumfries and Galloway Standard responded by publishing a lengthy epistle from the old road, written in Old Scots, starting, "I'm an old road," and it goes on at some length, and I'll give you a little flavour. "An old man took it into his head that I might as well be nae road ava, and put a stoppage into both my ends. Now you ken very well that roads and canals, like fishes and beasts and birds and all other living creatures, cannae exist if there's a stoppage at ane end or in baith. There's nae doubt the landed proprietor had this in his head, or if he doubts the truth of my word and wants to be convinced, he needs only to try a plug in his own throat or in some other part of the body. However, I had friends in adversity who came to my relief and released me frae the stoppages, aince twice set me free, and he kept me free so that I still remain the place where I was and am able to do service." But what do you think, Mr. Editor? An attempt was really made to prosecute my trusty friends who opened me at the ends. Who ever heard of a criminal prosecution for saving frae death by choking? Well, the prosecution ended in smoke. The authorities who had charge of they things had more sense than to proceed. The news flew like lightning from Kirkcudbright to Gatehouse that my liberators should be let alone. The town bell rang as merrily as it could, and to croon the celebration, an old cannon fired a salute towards Cally House with cow dung. It was a good enough shot for returning a salute to the attempt to choke me. 5 days later, I'll just remind you of the well. A local innkeeper and bricklayer, James Hornsby, went through the gate and into the grounds to draw water from the well. He claimed that the cistern at the top of the town was noisome and foul, and that he wished to get clean water from the well for his patrons of his inn. The proprietors again involved the Procurator Fiscal, who initiated criminal proceedings against Hornsby. By the time they'd started, Hornsby was over in Wigtonshire in Bladnoch doing a bricklaying job. He was said to be one of the best bricklayers in the country. And on the 17th of August 1854, a policeman was sent from Kirkcudbright to arrest him in the evening as he was getting ready for bed, and brought him back to be detained in Kirkcudbright. And on the following day, the proprietors presented a petition to the sheriff's substitute in Kirkcudbright, we're now moving firmly into the legal phase of the case, the Kirkcudbright Sheriff Court. So the owner came to court asking for a warrant from the sheriff authorising the rebuilding of the gates at both ends of the road, and an interdict, an order preventing 8 named residents of Gatehouse, including the ringleaders, from interfering with them. On the day the case called in front of him, the sheriff said, "I'm not going to grant an order today," but he directed the parties to lodge written statements setting out their positions. And then immediately after that, he heard the criminal complaint against Mr. Hornsby, who'd spent the night in the cells, and immediately, according to the Dumfries and Galloway standard, dismissed the case as frivolous. So we've now got 2 criminal cases that have been dismissed, but a civil case by the proprietors seeking authority to reconstruct the gates and order the townspeople to leave them alone. The case was of interest not only to the parties. According to the standard, there was a rumour that, and I quote, "the magnates of the district are about to raise a fund with the view of making an example of radical Gatehouse and to put down all agitations for rights of way and such like. If so," wrote the editor of the Standard, "we have much need of help, like the Turks on the Danube," and it's perhaps worth mentioning the Crimean War is raging just as this is happening in Gatehouse. "We fight a gallant battle, and not for ourselves alone, but without allies we will be crushed, and the leaden hoof upon Galloway." There's an important piece of, I'm afraid, legal technicality I need to mention, which is that at that time, only the Court of Session in Edinburgh could decide whether or not there was, in fact, a right of way. All the sheriff could do was deal with questions of possession and seek to maintain the correct state of possession as it existed, pending any final decision by the Court of Session on where the legal rights stood. So the only thing the sheriff was concerned about was what had been going on in the immediate prior period, what was the current state of affairs, who had first interfered with that state of affairs. And he ordered a proof, in effect, to determine what the condition and state of the gates had been across the road for the previous 7 years. The proof commenced on 3rd of October 1854, and over 9 days, 62 witnesses gave evidence. And I think it's worth, for anyone who does research into local history, worth being aware of the extraordinary resource that legal papers can be if there happens to be a court case that bears on a particular thing that you're interested in, because it is extraordinary when you read it's a narrative account, not a transcript, but a narrative of the evidence of witnesses. And you hear the voice of people who lived 100 years ago, or in the case of the 1760 case, hear the voice of people who lived 250 years ago, speaking about events that were themselves at that time in the past. So 62 witnesses, not a cheap court case. The legal costs had to be met, and on the 23rd of October, the Provost and Magistrates of Gatehouse called a public meeting to set up a defence fund. This was attended by, among others, the Provost of Kirkcudbright, who pledged support, and the Provost of Dumfries, Miles Layton, who had himself in Dumfries, the town council had taken action a few years earlier to protect a right of way in the vicinity of Dumfries. And he personally handed over £1 to the defence fund. A man called Robert Murdoch announced amid loud cheers that the working men of Gatehouse had collected a considerable sum which would be placed at the disposal of the committee. And Baillie Robert Coulthard read a letter from his brother, Andrew Coulthard of Antigua, expressing indignation at the attempt to shut up the road and advising that he and his brother, another brother living in Alabama, would show their sympathy in a substantial manner as soon as they knew that it was needed. And it's perhaps a contemporary footnote to note with some interest that perhaps Radical Gatehouse was being funded by contributions from two expats who were living in economies that at that time were slave economies. Anyway, on the 6th of November, the evidence in Kirkcudbright Sheriff Court concluded. The sheriff ordered the parties to lodge written statements of their positions, and the townspeople, these are the parts of the court papers, the townspeople, through their solicitor, Mr. McMinn, who was the town clerk of Gatehouse, lodged a minute offering to accept the re-erection of the gates at each end of the road, provided they were left unlocked and that people could continue to use them. And that minute proved to be tactically a very skillful move by Mr. McMinn. The proprietors haughtily refused the offer, and the sheriff went away to think about his decision. And about a month later, in December, he issued his decision, he found that for at least 7 years, a number of people from Gatehouse had been in the practice of passing through the gates and along the road without objection. And he also found that the proprietor had been in undisturbed possession of gates at each end of the road. So he decided that he would grant the proprietor's request for authority to reconstruct the gates until the rights of the parties could be finally decided in Edinburgh. And he went on to strongly deprecate the actions that townspeople had taken. He characterised the destruction of the lock-up gate as an illegal invasion of the proprietor's rights of property and an act of lawless violence calculated to provoke a breach of the peace. And he expressed particular regret that the magistrates of the town should have been in a position of promoting and defending such actions. He characterised their defence as entirely untenable and objectionable, held that most of their evidence was irrelevant and unnecessary, and found them liable for the expenses of the proprietors. That's a quote from his judgment. And you can see at the end he characterised what had happened as lawless acts. The townspeople appealed to the sheriff, who dismissed the appeal. That was a fairly short appeal, and then decided to appeal to the Court of Session in Edinburgh. And meantime, on 13th of December, a notice was published in the Standard seeking public support for the appeal. It's headed Glen Tilt in Galloway, clearly referring back to the cause célèbre in the Highlands. And it referenced the Crimean War. I'm going to quote a little from it. "Your aristocrat is your true revolutionist. Cunningly have our Tory czars chosen their time, when the nation's attention is absorbed by the deeds of their Russian brother, to perpetrate their synopy." Synopy was the battle in which the Russian Navy had attacked the Turkish Navy, and which prompted the Crimean War. "Their synopy at Gatehouse, all prepared. But we are not Turks. The blood that runs red through our veins rolled through the veins of those who now sleep calmly in Girthon Kirk. The men who bled with Wallace, who conquered with Bruce, who died for the Covenant. Like us, they were overmatched. Like them, we may be crushed, but we can never surrender. Our cause is as righteous as one as ever the sun shone on. It is for those of every country to say whether they will aid us to defend it in our hour of need. We fight not for ourselves alone. Let not our appeal be in vain. All subscriptions will be thankfully received by the Treasurer, Andrew Kirk." And in its editorial comment, the Standard expressed the hope that this appeal would be warmly supported by the public. And I think the connection with the Crimean War was obviously a very live one, because 2 weeks later, the Standard reporting on the Crimean War had a little note on Gatehouse men in the Crimea. And he said, and the report said, at least 6 of the men of Gatehouse-of-Fleet were with the army before Sebastopol, endeavouring to establish a right of way through the gates and through the walls of that beleaguered fortress. Some of them have fallen in the field of glory, fighting for the liberties of Europe. So they were certainly seeing their cause in a much larger scale. Anyway, having failed in the Sheriff Court, the attention shifted to Edinburgh, to the Court of Session, and the proprietors raised 2 actions. One was an action seeking the court, seeking an order from the court in effect declaring that the old parish road was no longer a right of way, that the 1806 minute had basically stopped it up. And they also raised an action against ex-Provost Kirk and Mr. Slimon for damages. The townspeople brought what was called a note of advocation, which was a form of appeal against the sheriff's decision. And they also brought their own action, seeking an order from the court declaring that there was still a right of way across the old parish road. And at the same time, Mr. Hornsby raised, for good measure, a couple of actions seeking damages for malicious prosecution against the proprietors and their solicitors. And this group of cases were all to be dealt with by a judge called Lord Neaves. Now, the effect of the note of advocation, the appeal, was to suspend the effect of Sheriff Dunbar's order authorising the gates to be rebuilt. And so the proprietors had an incentive to try and get things moving and have the appeal dealt with as quickly as possible, because until the appeal was dealt with, they couldn't safely reconstruct the gates. And the point was emphasised in early 1855 when one Peter McBride followed Mr. Hornsby's example by entering the estate to take water from the well. And although the Procurator Fiscal again issued a warrant, and he too was taken to Kirkcudbright, he was also, like Mr. Hornsby, immediately liberated. Now, the first procedural thing that happened was that Lord Neaves sent the note of advocation, the appeal, to the First Division, which is one of the 2 appeal courts in the Court of Session, chaired by the Lord President. And when the case first called in the First Division Court, there's the First Division courtroom, there's the Lord President and one of the other judges. Murray's lawyers asked the court to hear the appeal the following week, but the court refused. Faced with the prospect of a delay, they presented a formal application seeking an early hearing on the basis of the injury from the want of fences. At the hearing to consider this application to have the case heard quickly, the Town's Advocate drew the court's attention to the offer that Mr. McMinn had made during the Sheriff Court proceedings to accept gates provided they were unlocked. And when the court read that minute and was told that it had been rejected by the proprietor, the court peremptorily refused the proprietor's application to expedite the case. And I think this was the first indication that in the Court of Session, the judges were perhaps going to take a different view of what had happened. Again, the magistrates sought public support, this time in the national papers. This is an advert placed in the Scotsman. Glen Tilting Galloway is the heading. Liberty's a glorious cause, which is where I got the title for the talk. And starting the liberties of Scotland are dear to our sons, and so on and so on and so forth, and at the end saying that the right of way case is now in the Court of Session and requires both collective and individual support to withstand our money power. And one of the things we see throughout this is the townspeople upping the rhetoric in terms of what the way they're characterising their cause and the way they're trying to characterise it, and the support that they receive from the press. The Scotsman, rather, published a lengthy article criticising the sheriff's decision, and calling on the proprietor of Cally to reach a peaceful, equitable and desirable adjustment of the dispute. A dispute with a town, the inhabitants of which not only wish him well, but who, while refusing to have their rights trespassed upon, have always manifested a becoming respect for the rank and interests of the proprietor of Cally. Because while they were upping the rhetoric in public and eliciting press support, at the same time, behind the scenes, Provost Kirk and ex-Provost Kirkpatrick were actively trying to find an amicable resolution. Rather astonishingly, in the Broughton and Cally muniments, we have the very detailed solicitor's account of the Cally side of the case, so we know exactly what they were doing almost day by day in relation to the case. Sadly, we've nothing equivalent from the other side, and the town council records from Gatehouse are rather extraordinary, record only the annual election of the provost and magistrates and don't give any clue about what was happening. But in the Broughton and Cally muniments, there is a letter in the hand of ex-provost Thomas Kirkpatrick from May 1855, which he gave to a local landowner called Walter MacCulloch of Kirkclough, and which Walter MacCulloch passed on to the Stuarts at Cally. And the letter basically invites the proprietor to agree to a reference of the dispute to three local landowners, MacCulloch of Kirkclough, Hanny of Curdle, and Stuart of Cairnsmore for adjustment and settlement. And the letter goes on, thereby to lead to joy and rejoicing at this auspicious time when the young Laird of Cally is soon to reach his majority and in the plenitude of his power. The people of the district are quite disposed to pay all due honour and becoming respect to the young Laird of Broughton, but it is to be regretted that anything should have arisen to check that spirit of good feeling and loyalty to the proprietor, which has always existed since Gatehouse-of-Fleet was a borough. And they talk about the need for a proper and good understanding between superior and vassals in order that one and all may live in peace and harmony. And they go on to say, in all disputes of such kind, there are generally faults on both sides, and either good or bad counsel frequently meets with opposition. So the townspeople, at the same time as they're in public, advancing the cause in litigation, in the press, and gathering support, are also seeking to see if there's a way through. The Cally solicitors and counsel advised that this was not a good idea because any amicable agreement with the particular litigants wouldn't bind anybody else. And they advised that Cally really needed to have a decision from the court resolving the matter. So there's a minute of a meeting of Mr. Stewart and his curators in London, at which the letter from Mr. Kirkpatrick was considered and summarily rejected. A Gatehouse correspondent writing in the Standard suggested that the proprietors would come to regret that decision, since he suggested if the people were successful, there were other roads through the Cally to which similar arguments might apply. Anyway, throughout 1855, the Cally solicitors are carrying out inquiries into the history of the road. They're gathering their evidence. They took statements from witnesses, including Mr. Craig, the Cally factor from 1806, and they're taking the evidence of elderly witnesses so that it can be preserved. And at the end of the year, there were some discussions about a possible settlement, and things went so far that the press reported that the dispute had been settled, but that was premature. Again, the proprietors rejected the proposal that had come from the townspeople. And we now are into 1856, and during the court summer term of 1856, a little progress was made in the cases seeking a determination of the right-of-way case, in that the written phase of the case was completed, and a legal debate started, focusing on the effect of the minute of 1806. And the legal debate was conducted by Mr. Moyer, who's at the right here, who was the advocate for the town, and for the tally, the proprietors were represented by Edward Maitland, who was then the Solicitor General, and who was the son of Adam Maitland of Dundrennan. His brother had been MP for Kirkcudbright until a few years earlier, so local connections. And then Mr. Penny addressed the court for the townspeople, but unfortunately they didn't manage to complete the case, and John Ingalls, the then Dean of Faculty, who was going to close the case for the Murrays, was not available. He was tied up in other cases, and the case had to be adjourned until after the summer recess. And meantime, hopes that the appeal from the sheriff would be dealt with in the Inner House during the summer term were also disappointed for various reasons. And eventually that case appeared in the court in November 1856. And it was the same team of counsel representing the parties. It quickly became apparent that as far as this court was concerned, the real issue was not whether the proprietor could re-erect gates or not, but whether he could lock them or not. And questions from Lord Deas in particular during the Solicitor General's speech indicated that that was the critical question. And John Ingalls, for the proprietor, in what the press described as an ingenious speech, contended that for 7 years the gates were sometimes locked and sometimes not, and the sheriff's decision simply left them in that condition. And specifically, and I assume on the instructions he received, refused to undertake that if the gates were re-erected they would never be locked. And in November 1856 the court issued its decision holding that on the evidence, although there were gates at both ends of the road, these had not been used to prevent foot passengers, and deciding that although Mr. Murray was entitled to have gates, not least to prevent straying cattle, the real issue was whether he was entitled to use them to prevent the public from using the road. And the court held that it could not allow the proprietor to have things restored into a condition in which he might be allowed to obstruct the passage. He may be allowed to have gates there, and if so, then the townspeople should be interdicted from taking them down, but he cannot be allowed to use the gates to exclude the public, pending the decision of whether there was in fact a right of way or not. And Lord Deas in particular, in direct contrast to Sheriff Dunbar's attitude, expressed the view that it was the proprietors and not the townspeople who should have gone to court in order to resolve matters. A few weeks later, so that the townspeople have won effectively their appeal. A few weeks later, the case comes back before the court to deal with the issue of expenses. Rather boldly, Mr. Maitland, for the proprietor, says, well, we got everything we wanted. All we ever wanted was to be allowed to put the gates up and an interdict, and that's what we've been allowed to have. The court took the view that in reality the issue had always been about the locking of the gates, and that the proprietors had won. And Lord Deas said this: if there was a crime at all, it would be difficult to say that Mr. Murray was not art and part in it. He did the first lawless act. In place of applying to the court, he took the law into his own hands. He inverted the possession by excluding the public from a right we have found they were entitled to exercise. Now, if I fire the first shot into a crowd and the crowd then fire a return and a riot ensues, am I not art and part in that riot? I could certainly not be said to be blameless, nor can Mr. Murray be held to be so here. So the townspeople to this point have won their appeal. The court in Edinburgh has taken a dim view of the way that the Cali proprietors have proceeded. And the Standard, the Dunfermline Standard, applauded the decision and called on the parties to forget the past and bury the acrimony. Meantime, there was better news for Mr. Murray in relation to Mr. Hornsby's actions. The court dismissed those on the basis that Mr. Hornsby couldn't show that anyone had been actuated by malice in referring his case to the Procurator Fiscal. The Standard lamented that outcome. Mr. Hornsby, besides being punished by his arrest, is saddled with enormous expenses, and yet the man has committed no offence, said the press. What was left over, of course, was the really fundamental question for everybody, which was there a right-of-way or not? The debate that had started in front of Lord Neaves before the summer vacation was due to resume in November, but Mr. Ingalls was still not available, and so the case was again put off. Eventually it was concluded, and Lord Neaves decided he wasn't prepared to decide the case on the basis of the papers alone. He wasn't prepared to hold that the minute of 1806 had had the legal effect of stopping up the road. And so he fixed an evidential hearing at which Mr. Murray could come along and bring witnesses and try and show that in fact the road had been stopped. Given the ambiguous factual position, this was a serious setback for Murray, and while he appealed against Lord Neaves' decision, at this point his solicitors now started to sue for peace, and the solicitors' accounts disclosed they consulted with Mr. Maitland, met him with their client to discuss possible settlement proposals, and after that meeting they proposed a settlement to the townspeople, and eventually in March 1857 a settlement was reached. It was reported in the press in the following terms. The defender has consented to give the public a foot road of 4 feet in breadth, leading from the village of Gatehouse to the Clachan of Girthon through his estate of Cally, and to pay the whole expenses incurred by the pursuers. And what he did, what was agreed, it's slightly unclear because there's only a written description. Unfortunately, there's no map. But I think what happened, looking at the written description, is that Mr. Murray agreed that there should be a right-of-way along, in effect, what was the old turnpike road to join the road marked in green, which had been stopped up in 1823, and joining the public road, the Blue Road, the 1806 road, at the top end. And so everybody got something out of this. Mr. Murray got the right-of-way pushed a little further away from his house to what had been the line of the old turnpike road. The townspeople, he also had the benefit of, because of the way the court order was framed, of, in effect, closing off the argument that there was still a right-of-way along the old parish road. The townspeople got their more convenient route to Girthon, and perhaps importantly, they got the whole expenses that had been incurred. So everyone got something out of it. So that's the story. I think it's a really interesting case. One of the things I found interesting as I found more about it was that, as far as I could tell, it had dropped entirely from public memory. Although I was very interested in local history, I had never heard of this extraordinary incident when 600 or 700 residents of Gatehouse, led by the town council, had gone up the top of Ann Street and marched down to Girthon to insist on the rights of the town. I think there's something quite interesting in terms of social history, mid-19th century social history, the way in which the relationship between the sort of civic pride and corporate action of the town interacted with the proprietors. I think there's something, certainly as a professional litigator, immensely impressive with the way that the townspeople not only advanced their cause through litigation, but were skillfully using the press and ramping up the public rhetoric, and at the same time very skillfully seeking to promote a settlement behind the scenes. And it's fair to say that in terms of the litigation process, the proprietors look as if they were a bit behind the curve for all the highly skilled and sophisticated representation that they had. I think it also illustrates the value for local history of looking at a wide range of sources. What was interesting, I found, was looking at the court papers, where you get this intense view of events and the voice of witnesses from a century and a half ago, and then to go to the local press, where the case has been covered in great detail, clearly with a lot of inside knowledge, and the press also playing its own part in the case. So what happened to the people involved? Well, Charles McMinn, the town clerk, the solicitor whose minute of making the offer to accept that there should be a gate, but an unlocked gate, was so important to the ultimate outcome. He died in 1855, aged 45, and so he never saw the end of the case, and was buried at Girthon Kirkyard. History doesn't relate how his coffin got from Gatehouse to Girthon. Baillie Coulthard died in 1858 and was also buried at Girthon in the gravestone I showed you earlier. Provost Kirk died in 1863. He'd gone back to Alloa, his hometown. Provost Kirkpatrick lived until 1885 and again was buried at Girthon in the old family plot. And Horatio Granville Murray Stewart lived a long, very long life to 1904. Made his peace with the townspeople. One wonders whether he had learned something. And at the end of the century, when Malcolm Harper wrote Rambles in Galloway and described Cally House, he said this: Mr. Murray Stewart, with a liberality which is commendable in the highest degree and worthy of imitation in others, permits strangers to have access to the grounds of Cally. On their applying to his factor, who gives cards of admission which are available from 10 till 2 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I think what's so interesting about that quote is that by this time, by 1896, 40 years later, it's clear that the memory of this extraordinary dispute has already, the water's already closed over it. And this is the contemporary view of that time. And he was buried, Horatio Granville Murray Stewart, not in the old Girthon graveyard, but in the new Girthon graveyard in Gatehouse Town. So thank you for your attention. I hope that's been interesting. And if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.